Well, greetings. It is my great honor today to welcome to KEI's conversation series the former Prime Minister of the Republic of Korea, Chung. I consider him a friend from my time in Korea as U.S. Ambassador. He has a most distinguished career as an academic, an economist, a public servant. I'm only going to give you the highlights because I want to spend our time on a conversation on subjects that I think are so relevant to the moment we're in now, because the former Prime Minister is now chairman of the Korea Institute for Shared Growth. And we're going to talk about what he's doing now and the experience that he and the Republic of Korea bring to these challenges that all of us in the United States and throughout the world are facing now as we emerge from this economic and health crisis that we are still in. So welcome, Prime Minister. I want to tell our listeners who may not be familiar with all that you've done very briefly that we know you have very deep ties to the United States, including a PhD from Princeton University, teaching career at Columbia University before you returned to Seoul National University for a long and distinguished career there as a professor of economics. I recall when I first met you as ambassador in Korea, you were serving as the president of Seoul National University. And of course, it was my honor when I was ambassador in Korea to meet you as South Korea's prime minister. Since then, or before and since then, you've served as the chairman of the Committee on National Pension Development in the Ministry of Health and Welfare, the chairperson of the Financial Development Committee in the Ministry of Finance and Economy. And now, as I mentioned, you are leading the Korea Institute on Shared Growth. So again, welcome. 환영합니다. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Actually, thank you very much for your invitation. I will do my best.
Thank you. I have to mention, I forgot to mention that I also remember feeling very close to you because you told me that your hometown is in Gongju, in Chungcheongnam-do. And of course, I used to live in Yesan, which is nearby. And of course, those are two places that have changed beyond recognition in some ways.
Yeah, those two towns are well known as the Yangban towns.
Yes, very scholarly. You may live up to that. I'm not sure that I do, but I certainly remember Chungnam very fondly. So I thought we'd start very broadly, Prime Minister, given your very broad background, and talk a little bit about Korea's economic journey and where we are now. I mean, I know that's a big topic. But you know, it's become a cliche. I mean, a very profound point, but kind of almost a cliche to say that Korea's economic rise was a miracle. I'm not sure it was a miracle. I think it had to do with a lot of factors, which I hope you can help us understand more deeply. But we also know that South Korea faces many challenges now in terms of its growth prospects, in terms of inequality, in terms of some other issues we want to get into. But maybe just to start off with, I'd like your perspective, and I know our listeners would love to hear your perspective on South Korea's extraordinary economic journey to this point, and what you see as the main challenges it faces now as we move into a post-COVID, post-pandemic economy.
The Korean economic journey started in 1962, at which time per capita GDP of Korea was only $100 US, and the first 5-year economic development plan was launched. Korea is now among the 7 countries in the world which have a population larger than 50 million people, and at the same time, per capita GDP higher than $30,000 US. The other 6 countries are the US, Japan, Germany, England, France, and Italy. In my opinion, 2 key words account for Korea's unprecedented growth: industrialization and education. What stands out from Korea's industrialization is the Korean government's export-led growth strategy. Korea is not endowed with rich natural resources, and arable land accounts for just 20% of the total land. In such a condition, export-led growth strategy played an important role in the economic success of Korea. Korea's growth recently relies on heavy and chemical industries and internet and communication technologies. And these industries cannot bloom without highly trained human resources. Korean people boast a great passion for education, which enabled them to contribute to Korea's fast development. Indeed, the most serious problems that Korea is facing now are the weakening of growth potential and the worsening of economic inequality. These problems had plagued Korea even in the pre-COVID era, but have been worsened during COVID-19. Post-COVID is an era none of us has experienced in person, and uncertainty is very high. As you know, Korea's economy is heavily dependent on exports, and we must pay close attention to how fast the rest of the world recovers its purchasing power to buy from Korea at the pre-COVID level. Also, inflation in real estate value is another concern. Korea has fiscally expanded to prevent economic shock during the COVID-19 pandemic, and a large part of the infused cash flowed into the real estate market. Mm-hmm. The steep rise in real estate prices poses a threat to the economy because it led to a higher level of household debt and, more importantly, to a division of social unity. The gap between the haves and have-nots has widened during COVID-19, and we cannot move forward as a country without addressing the widening division. Polarization in income has led to increase in household and SME debts, which in turn depressed domestic spending, lowering the growth rate of the Korean economy, and completing the vicious cycle by worsening polarization again. Shared growth is a philosophy that attempts to break this vicious cycle to bring back energetic vitality and productivity to the Korean economy.
Yeah, thank you, Prime Minister. That's a great overview of about 50 years of extraordinarily dramatic developments in South Korea. And I really relate to much of what you say because I feel like I saw some of this myself living in Korea and over the years, as you mentioned. I mean, in the 1970s, the move to industrialization, the way that was really raising, as the tide was raising all boats. People felt they could all get ahead. Education was so important. People felt that there was tremendous opportunity. And I remember going back in the 1980s when also, as you say, the inequality or the Gini coefficient, I first learned about that in Korea, or I remember learning in Korean to say binbu chai, the gap between rich and poor was actually, pretty good on a global scale. People were getting rich, but everyone was still doing better. But then we had these changes over the last couple of decades where the inequality grew, even as Korea's economy grew. And the role of the very large companies became so much bigger in comparison to the others. And I'm repeating all this because it's interesting to me living back in the United States now. In many ways, that's the debate going on in the United States now as well. We've enjoyed enormous economic growth, but the issues of inequality and distribution have become greater and much more politically salient. So in that context, I know I'm very interested in hearing from you, just a little bit more about this concept of shared growth and how you approach that, in particular, how that can contribute to coming out of the economic and pandemic crisis that we have suffered.
First of all, why don't I explain something about how I came to promote shared growth.
Please.
Okay? Yes. I'm committed to promote shared growth because of a lesson from Dr. Schofield. Are you familiar with him?
I'm not. So he
Oh, okay. He fought alongside Koreans for Korea's independence from Japan 100 years ago, especially in 1919, where independence movement was spreading across the country. After independence, Dr. Schofield worked to help Korea recover from destruction and devastation from the Japanese colonial rule and the Korean War. He shared all of his earthly possessions with students in need. I was one of the students who received his help. As an economist, the lesson from Dr. Schofield has had a profound influence on me. To combat polarization of income and wealth, I have been advocating shared growth in Korea, and I'm currently serving as the chairman of Korea Institute for Shared Growth. Then let me say a little bit about what shared growth is. Shared growth is a philosophy that promotes economically growing together. As early as in the 1980s, I started to argue for shared growth in my book and on many other occasions, which might have sounded like an early warning at the time. Various people in different fields may refer to it with a slightly different name. For example, OECD or Hillary Clinton uses the term inclusive economy, which I think has similar ideas with the shared growth. What is more important than what we call it is what growing together truly means. By growing together, shared growth aims to promote fairer distribution without curbing vigorous economic growth. And the problem is that people sometimes misconstrue shared growth as a distribution mechanism that takes something away from the rich and giving it away to the poor. I do not blame them because traditionally, if you wanted to push for economic growth, distribution had to take a back seat. Likewise, emphasizing distribution meant that you were giving up growth. Shared growth says otherwise. Economic growth and distribution are not at opposite ends of the spectrum. Growth and distribution can be achieved at the same time by growing the economic pie bigger and distributing the fruit of the growth fairly amongst contributors. We come to the question, how can we achieve shared growth? Three economic policies at the front for accomplishing shared growth. First of all, profit sharing is a policy that directs large conglomerates and SMEs to share profit that surpasses the expected or targeted level. The profit in excess is shared with SMEs according to SMEs' contribution. SMEs carry out important parts of large conglomerate operations, and it is logical and fair for both parties to share the profit according to their contributions. I would say this is pretty much like profit sharing between firms and workers that is being discussed in the US in many respects. Profit sharing is also well known in Hollywood in the form of running guarantee and most successfully practiced at NFL, National Football League, in the form of revenue sharing among the NFL 32 teams. Secondly, SME appropriate business list facilitates the process of achieving shared growth. SMEs are in dire need of support, especially in the beginning stages of business, to survive and cultivate competitiveness. By announcing SME appropriate business list, we can set off protective areas for SMEs in which they can hone their competitiveness before competing against large conglomerates. Thirdly and lastly, setting off a certain amount of government projects just for SMEs would help us achieve shared growth. When large conglomerates perform government projects, most of the work is delegated to SMEs through subcontracting. In the process, large conglomerates merely function as middlemen, and they take away from the profit that should have gone to the SMEs. By setting off a certain portion of the government projects, SMEs will suffer less from competing unfairly. Large conglomerates have money, but they do not have enough investment opportunities for which cutting-edge technology is needed. SMEs know where to invest, but they do not have enough money. Shared growth connects the broken link from the large conglomerates to SMEs. This way, large enterprises sit in cash, finds its uses, while SMEs improve their profit. This link between the large conglomerates and SMEs leads to increase in investment, production, employment, income, and consumption. This serves as a cure for improving short-term growth and the basis for a long-term sustainable growth. In addition to that, 99% of corporations in Korea are SMEs, and they account for 88% of employment. Therefore, when shared growth policies take place and are successful, they will improve income wealth distribution issues as well. Of course, in the medium term, large enterprises should spend more on research rather than on development for cutting-edge technology, which will enlarge investment opportunities. You must know that Korea's R&D spending is very large. Korea must rank about 5th in the world in terms of the amount of R&D spending, while compared to the size of the economy, Korea or Israel is the fourth spender in R&D. The problem in Korea is that of R&D, most of R&D is on D, not R. And even the small amount of R is not research, but refinement. You know what refinement means, right? That is the problem. Why this is the problem? The large conglomerates do not know how to invest, where to invest, because they do not have basic technology, cutting-edge technology, right? Okay. Now, in addition, of course, in the medium term, the large corporations must spend more on research rather than on development. And in the long term, education reform must be accompanied. I will talk about this later. In other words, we must reform Korea's educational system so that we foster creative talents rather than those who imitate others. That we need educational reform.
Yeah, you make some really profound points here, and I hope we will have time to return to several of them. I want to reflect on a couple of them from an American perspective, because I think they are so important, and they often get lost in how Americans think about the South Korean experience. And one is on this question of R&D, and your insights into that are very helpful. I remember, again, during my time in Korea as ambassador, President Obama visited several times, and he always made a point of asking about R&D and coming back to the US and saying, a country like South Korea is investing so much more than the US is in R&D. We need to do more. He used, and actually in education as well, he would say, look at what Korea does in education. He was using it as a spur to say, we in America need to learn from that. But what I always heard in Korea was, that's nice to hear, but also we need to do our R&D better. Our education has a lot of problems. We need to fix all that. So it's very much part of that conversation I think we've had over the years, that we see things in each other's countries to be inspired by or emulate or learn from, but we're also very aware of the weaknesses. And the other thing that you mentioned, I really wanted to highlight again, because I think it's so important and not very well known in the United States, is this extraordinary figure you mentioned that I think you said 99% of the corporations in South Korea are small and medium enterprises. You know, in the American mind, I mean, right, Korean business is all about the big companies. And you know, you might say the same thing about America too. But even more extraordinary that those SMEs in Korea account for 88% of employment in South Korea. That's just extraordinary. And it does make me think, and again, I'm saying this kind of for our American audience. I recall a couple of times I've gone down to Georgia and Alabama, and Hyundai and Kia have plants, respective plants, one in Georgia, one in Alabama, and then there's a very nice road between them. And of course they brought tremendous investment and jobs to the United States, which we appreciate. But in between there are all these SMEs, right? American SMEs, Korean SMEs, and so on, that are part of this supply chain, this value chain that I think that you're emphasizing is so important to take into account when we think about this. So I just mentioned that to kind of give, I think, an American perspective too on how we are seeing that Korean phenomenon as well as the American phenomenon right here in our own country as we try to build it. So I appreciate those remarks very much.
In 2008, I was on leave from Seoul National University to Princeton. And at the time, Mr. Obama told the Americans to learn much from Korean education. I was shocked because you have more problems with the education. From my understanding, you emphasize creativity, especially creativity through diversity in the US. Yeah. But in Korea, what is happening is quite different from America. Therefore, I have been trying to change the Korean educational system very much. Again, I will talk about that later.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. No, you're right. And I say during my time in Korea, the thing that honestly, sometimes Koreans complain to me, most people come up to me and say, why don't you tell President Obama to stop praising the Korean education system? There's so many problems. You, Madam Ambassador, need to tell your president how the problems. I said, oh, I will tell him, but still there is much to admire, but we'll get to that. Anyway, but another thing that I think is of great interest right now everywhere, and I think there's a Korean kind of experience that we might be very interested in learning something from, and that's this idea of universal basic income, UBI. I'm not sure if that's what you call it in Korea, but I mean, do you see that as part of shared growth? And what's your sense on Korea's experience with that so far?
I don't think it's unrelated to shared growth, but there's no direct relationship between UBI and shared growth. Anyway, why don't I talk a little bit about my thinking on UBI?
Okay, I welcome that. Yeah.
Okay, if UBI, universal basic income, is defined very tightly as non-conditional, nationwide, and recurrent payment, Korea has no experience of a pure type of UBI. But if we loosen the definition, then we may find a few examples. One of them, non-conditional, nationwide, but not recurrent, is cash payments during the COVID-19 period, as other countries did as well. Another example, non-conditional, recurrent, but not nationwide, is the Youth Basic Income Program, which is experimented in the Gyeonggi province since 2018. But as the presidential election draws near, UBI becomes a hot and nationwide issue, especially there is a feud on that between Mr. Lee Jae-myung and Mr. Chung Se-kyun, the current prime minister. Mr. Lee Jae-myung is the governor of the Gyeonggi province, as you know. UBI is the direction worth considering to take, but we must take that direction with extreme caution, I would say. UBI can function as a way to offset whatever income lost due to the automation of workplaces. In addition, we must take care of the already poverty-stricken people. For that purpose, UBI is needed. But we must make sure that UBI raises the minimum level of life without creating moral hazards.
Mhm.
There is a very daunting obstacle to fully fledged UBI program. It is financing problems. Neither short-term UBI trials nor mass cash transfers in response to COVID-19 required governments to take on the difficult task of financing enormous new expansions to the welfare state. Much of the aid provided to households over the past year has been finances with new government borrowing. As accommodating as markets have been of government borrowing over the past year, it seems unlikely that UBI dreams can be made real without the question of financing eventually being asked and answered. I mean, it's not an easy problem, although we must take that into consideration in one way or the other.
Mhm.
That's it about UBI. I'm
Yeah.
not quite familiar with that concept, actually.
No, thank you. Well, I think we're at a very early stage in that conversation, but it's become part of our political conversation here as well. It's very interesting to see Korea's conversation. If I might, I want to turn back to your earlier comments about the big corporations and and we talked about that and their predominance in the economy, and of course, as we already talked about, I mean, I think many Americans know in Korean it's chaebol. They may not know exactly what the literal meaning is, but chaebol meaning these big conglomerates. And in fact, I've seen some articles. There was one in The Economist about a year ago saying we should start using the word chaebol to describe the big American companies like Amazon and Facebook, that we're moving into chaebol era. So anyway, but I think it'd be really, obviously you're a perfect person to talk about the role of chaebol moving forward. Clearly, they've been part of building the Korea we know today, and what they can do. You've mentioned a few things, but maybe a little bit more on what they can do to address this concentration of wealth.
They have been contributing to the Korean economy. Even President Kim Dae-jung once said the current development of Korea was attributed to the industrial forces as much as or more than the democratization forces. I also appreciate the Jaebal's contribution to the development of the Korean economy and society. In my opinion, Jaebal leadership is getting outdated. First of all, their branched out business structures may have succeeded in the past when Korea's market lacked a foundation. But such aggressive expansion of business is, on the contrary, adding pressure to the Jaebals today. Indeed, a Jaebal reform is required. The governance structure of large corporations should be made transparent, and excessive concentration of economic power should be restrained. It is also necessary to eradicate unfair trading practices such as the forced slashing of supply prices and technology stealing in subcontracting transactions between large and small companies. Why don't I emphasize this again? It is also necessary to eradicate unfair trading practices such as the forced slashing of supply prices and technology stealing in subcontracting transactions between large and small companies. Efforts should also be made to protect ally businesses and to designate industries suitable for SMEs. That's all that can I say about Jaebal
Well,
or
thank
Jaebal
you. No,
government.
that's a very good perspective. So I guess when we talk about, I mentioned that we have our big conglomerates growing bigger in the United States, and concentration in large companies has certainly been a phenomenon of growth in the United States as well over the last couple of decades. I guess they're not chaebol in the sense they're not family-owned businesses per se, but I mean, what do you see are the implications of your analysis for big tech companies that also obviously have a big influence in Korea too, like Amazon or Facebook, Apple? Is that what would be your advice to Americans about kind of the shared growth concept, given the predominance of big tech companies like that?
Yeah, big tech companies are no exception to shared growth, of course. Many tech companies today provide a platform on which services or products can be sold. In this type of business ecosystem, platform providers are in a position to exert unfair pressures on the smaller companies that use the platform, because the customers are attracted to major platforms, and smaller companies have no option but to use the platform. Shared growth directs our attention to the fact that big tech platform businesses cannot survive without smaller enterprises that use the platform. Larger corporations owe their success in part to the creativity and risks taken by the smaller companies. Instead of writing every bit of profit out of smaller companies, big tech companies must proactively seek ways to share the fruit of growth fairly with their partners. That is how both sides develop a sustainable relationship that brings bigger growth to them both. Again, frankly speaking, I'm not quite familiar with these platforms, but after getting the homework, I was trying to apply my shared growth idea to the big tech companies in America.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I think those insights are very helpful. And I know one thing that you've looked at is something that came out, recently in the United States, where I think Google and Apple, who control the app platforms, have started charging less to the app developers. And this is, I lived in, I was at Stanford University in Silicon Valley for a while, and I just remember anecdotally, all these young startups, or some of them weren't so young, but these new startups, they used to really complain about that, right? How do you can develop a great app, but then you have to pay so much. So that's something that certainly has gotten a lot of attention here in the United States, and I think goes to, again, the fact that we're having the same kind of conversation here that you're trying to lead in Korea about some of these imbalances.
Yeah, it was nice to hear that Google has recently announced that they would lower the in-app transaction fee to 15% of the sales for companies whose annual sales do not exceed $10 million.
Mm-hmm. That was it.
Right information.
That was it. Yeah, exactly. No, I noticed that too, just because I said I'd heard so much about that. So forces at work to address some of these issues. I want to step back. Get back a little bit more into the kind of the diplomatic area, if you like, of the U.S. Korea economic relationship, and I think it's very much a pillar. We've spent a lot of time talking about the security relationship, but especially since the ratification of the implementation of the U.S. Korea Free Trade Agreement almost 10 years ago. It seems like a different era now, but at the time it was, I think, South Korea's biggest free trade agreement, and for the U.S. the biggest one since NAFTA. You mentioned that I think as we started this conversation, that of course Korea is such an export-oriented nation. That's how it built itself. It's built on trade. It's trying to regenerate all that. Attitudes in the United States about trade and globalization have really been in flux, right, over the last few years. So I think that has to have an impact on our relationship. But I think given all that, I'd be interested in, and given the fact that there is now, I think, more political noise in the United States about the role that the U.S. will play and restoring the WTO, and the Biden administration, we have, I think, a return to a more familiar U.S. approach than during the Trump administration. But nonetheless, from the South Korean perspective, what's your prognosis for U.S.-South Korean economic relations going forward?
Yeah, the U.S.-Korea economic relation is a very important, serious, and at the same time, sensitive problem.
Yeah.
Sensitive problem, but let me try to introduce my idea on that point. Regarding the U.S.-Korea economic relations, common concern for two countries is the China problem. Do you agree?
I do.
the US and China are struggling for hegemonic power, and it causes a big dilemma to Korea. When the US and China are conflicting against each other in some issues, Korea is likely to be enforced to choose between the US and China. Korea needs the US for security and relatively China for the economy, because economic tie with China has more and more deepened. I would say there is one way for the US to help Korea avoid this dilemma. For the past years, we feel the protectionism in the US has gradually increased, while China claims it is more and more opening the economy. The rapid expansion and opening of the Chinese market have deepened the economic linkage of Korea to China. To reverse or at least halt the trend, the US needs to take more opening attitude towards Korea, as she did in the past. Is it too much? No, but the US share in Korea's trade volume has decreased continuously over time, leading to the weakened economic influence of the US in Korea. However, the technology leadership of the US economy in general, and that of a few world-leading US firms in particular, compels Korea to strengthen industrial and technology cooperation with the US. Increasing FDI of leading Korean companies such as Hyundai Motors, LG, and Samsung should be strengthened, and they should be able to enter into a working, high-quality division of labor between the two countries. Joint ventures could be stimulated as well, especially in the future industries like biochemistry and biomedicine sector, aerospace industries, and automotive sectors. Military alliance relationship could this way be expanded to economic alliance, taking the Korean economy slowly but continuously away from the Chinese dominance. Moreover, the U.S. Korea FTA was renegotiated upon the request by the Trump administration. A series of such policies by the U.S. is partly responsible for an increasingly tilted structure of Korean trade towards China, which now accounts for around 25% of total Korean exports. This is a serious concern for Korean economy too, calling for a need to diversify the trade structure. Against this background, a reversal or removal of the previous trade policies against Korea by the Biden administration will greatly improve the relationship between Korea and the US, which will also eventually help Korea alleviate high dependency on China. I'm afraid this is too political, but that's
no,
my.
as you say, it was a very political problem. With it is a very geopolitical problem, and I don't think we can put the economic or the trade issues in their own, less political venue. But I think this is these are important points that you make. Like you, I think that the fact that there has been considerable investment by Korean firms in the United States, particularly in some of these emerging areas of the technological areas, of high-tech areas, of lithium batteries and green technologies and so on. It was going to help build some of those strategic partnerships I think that you're talking about. And I have to say, I also agree with you, and I think many Americans would too, that while certainly there's a lot more suspicion about in the United States as a political matter about global trade and what the U.S. has done before, we have to move away, and I think we are under the Biden administration, from a kind of a zero sum that that we have no partners in this. I think South Korea has to be a partner, as do other countries that also are concerned about some of China's practices, and where we may have some differences, but we have a lot that we can share in trying to rebuild some of the institutions of international trade and fairness. And in that regard, I guess the other thing I wanted to just get your sense about is the future of these regional trade agreements. I, like many, think it was really unfortunate that that the United States pulled away from the TPP. I think the prognosis here is that it may be a while, even optimistically, before the Biden administration circles back to that. But in the meantime, South Korea has some important choices to make. Does it join the CPTPP? Does it try to build a trading relationship or trade agreement with Japan and China? What does it do at a time when maybe the U.S. is going to need some time to build its own new trade policy?
Yeah, again, this is somewhat a political problem, but let me introduce my thinking, my thought on this. An official position of the Korean government is that the CPTPP membership is still under consideration by the government. It appears that the Korean government has figured so far potential losses might be greater than potential gains from the CPTPP membership, which is why Korea has not joined yet. However, it can be a big game changer for Korea if the US decided to join the CPTPP. In the beginning, without the US, the current CPTPP doesn't provide enough incentive for the Korean economy to participate. The procedure towards the CPTPP membership is also somewhat burdensome, as the aspirant country has to negotiate with all the 11 countries. However, if the US rejoins the CPTPP, there is no reason for the Korean government to hesitate the membership process to the CPTPP, as we have also to balance our economic diplomacy between the US and China. As to the trilateral trade agreement among the three countries, I think it's an excellent opportunity to reinvigorate the economic dynamics of the three countries. And the trilateral FTA can also be used as an instrument to stabilize the security environment of the Northeast Asian region. In short, CJK FTA, I mean China, Japan, Korea FTA, and stronger cooperation and integration of three countries is an instrument to guarantee the survival economically and security-wise of Korea. But I'm not sure whether this is possible in the near future.
Well, it's something to watch. And I think one thing that we in the US have to be particularly aware of is even if the US takes a slower approach to engaging on these issues, others will move ahead. We have RCEP as well, but other things are happening and we need to watch them closely. So your perspective on this is much appreciated. I know we're being very, we're asking for a lot of time and thought from you, and we really appreciate it. But if you do have the time, I wanted to shift, you'd mentioned earlier that perhaps we could talk a little bit about another key factor in Korea's past and in its future, and is education. And of course, your deep experience and your own extraordinary story as well in terms of your education and how that brought you into your own life and profession and your work at SNU. I would really appreciate your thoughts on Korea's educational system and what needs to be done. You've suggested a few things, but I know it's. I don't think I've ever talked about education as much as when I'm with Koreans, because it is I think a deep and much admired aspect of Korea. Actually, North and South, I suppose. It comes from Korea's past, but is very much part of its present. But as you say, I think there's also deep dissatisfaction in the sense that challenges have to be addressed. And we feel that again in our country as well. So I would welcome your thoughts.
Okay. Yeah, let me talk a little bit about the needed Korean educational reform. And why don't I say a little bit about what I did when I was president of Seoul National University.
Yeah.
Korea's education in the past has been focusing on emulation, frankly speaking. To grow fast, Korea has focused on following other nations' paths. We learned from other countries, memorized the lessons, and applied the knowledge to make it our own.
Mm.
But with Korea's growth, this type of education no longer can provide the right type of human capital Korea needs. We must quickly switch over to foster creative human capital. We must incite students' creativities and make them question instead of accepting. I'm not sure whether this is a right expression, but Korea may not be used to this type of education, but we must adjust to the changing global setting. Korea must find a new educational frame that fits its grown size. In the past, emulation was quite enough, but now we need creativity. But the present educational system in Korea is not good enough to uh, have enough creativity. As president of SNU, I tried to create an educational environment for fostering creativity and critical thinking within students. To do so, I redesigned the curriculum to transform SNU as a place where knowledge was created instead of where knowledge was transformed from professors to students. In addition, I emphasized openness throughout the campus because creativity can never bear fruit without an open mind to receive original ideas.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first measures to underscore creativity was reformation of the admissions process to take regional balance into account. Actually, that is already that is what has already happened in America, but in Korea, we didn't experience that before my presidency at Seoul National University. When I came into office, SNU's student body was mainly composed of students from the city of Seoul,
Mm-hmm.
almost 50%, despite the fact that SNU is a national university. Otherwise, I mean, if not change the student body composition, then Seoul National University will become Seoul City University or Gangnam-gu University. There are a lot from Gangnam-gu.
Right.
As president, I reformed the admissions process to admit 1/3 or more of the student body from across the nation, according to the geographical quota, and remaining 2/3 or fewer following the traditional procedure. This way, students and professors are exposed to greater indirect experiences from fellow scholars of different backgrounds, and such exposure stimulates creative thinking that leads to new ideas. That's what I did at Seoul National University about 15 or more years ago.
Yeah. No, I mean, I certainly saw that the fruits of that at Seoul National University and some that when I visited there numerous times after you were president. And I would add to that, if I could, that I think that another thing that Korean universities have now is more foreign students. And that also introduces a different element, which was not present a couple of decades ago when there were very few foreign students, and of course the language barriers seem so great and so on. And I well remember some very creative and stimulating conversations with these incredible students you get from all over Korea and from abroad. So that's a very welcome thing. But I know it's an ongoing issue in Korea, and it also feeds into the concerns about then what do the students do after they graduate, and this sense of this highly competitive world they're in, and nowhere more competitive than Korea, and that other great sort of social issue in Korea of underemployment or unemployment of young graduates. I mean, maybe South Korea is producing too many graduates, or is it not just not with creativity, but not apparently with the skills that are needed, or the jobs aren't there. But what is the problem there? I think we have trouble kind of understanding that.
First of all, I'm sorry that Seoul National University uh, is not open enough. It's still open, not open enough, but it will become more open and more open sooner or later, I would say. But as to the youth problem or youth employment problem, let me introduce what is happening in Korea. My answer for the youth is to broaden their perspectives. In my humble opinion, the younger generation converges on a few jobs that look attractive. For example, a considerable percentage of college graduates prepare for exams to enter civil service. The rest focus on large companies, civil service and large company working. I want to tell young people that true leaders are those who can turn a potential into something great. Big corporations may pay well and offer posh conditions, but they also have little room to grow. When you break free from the tunnel vision on civil service and big corporations, there are plenty of SMEs with great potentials that require the new leadership of the youth. Not only that, but we can also turn our focus to the rest of the world. There are plenty of nations that look to Korea now for guidance. Developing countries view Korea as their role models. Developed nations value Korean people's skills and work ethics. Shared growth literally means to share. If the youth is willing to share their skills with nations and corporations in need, there lies a way for them to grow together. Shared growth guides us in designing education for future generations, especially so in the globalized world. By encouraging active discussions among students on the importance of shared growth and sustainable economy, shared growth will gather enough energy to break from outdated economic and social beliefs. Higher education is the place where students should be encouraged to follow their passion and be creative. Universities must share growth with the local community and serve as the source of energy for creativity, the key to success in today's world. Although the pandemic has been putting young students' energy on hold, I believe that soon enough they will bounce back with their original ideas. That is a very serious problem, a youth unemployment problem. Nobody, I would say, nobody has a correct answer to that, but we have had discussions on that for a long time. University people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I don't think there is one simple answer, because it is so tied to the other issues we face. But I think you've highlighted a couple of things, which, as you say, once we get back to a period where the youth are able to resume more normal lives, it's getting, for example, getting some experience overseas. I very much enjoyed meeting many Korean youth who served in the Korean version of the Peace Corps, who went abroad with Korea's many development projects and gained tremendous experience and exposure through that. And it really shaped some of their ideas about what they could do going forward. And I guess I related to that very personally and saw, I guess, my young self in them. And I'm very happy to see that there are some opportunities like that, but there certainly need to be much more. I agree.
Right.
So I know we're coming to the end of our time, but I can't resist, because I know you're a huge baseball fan and former commissioner of Korean baseball, and Americans are much more familiar with Korean baseball now for a number of reasons, but one being that part of Korea's relatively successful and much admired response to the COVID pandemic was that it was able to continue to have baseball games in restricted ways. And we enjoyed seeing them when we weren't having American baseball. So we've gotten a taste of Korean baseball, and maybe like getting a taste of Korean food, it will become an addiction. But I want to hear about how you became addicted to baseball and what your thoughts are about anything, U.S. Korean relations, through baseball diplomacy and anything else. Your favorite team?
Actually, in addition to that, I would like to say a few words about my life in America.
Oh, please.
In the 1970s.
Yeah.
I owe America what I'm today. Truly, I mean, I owe America what I'm today. Miami University of Ohio and Princeton University taught good economics to me at the graduate level, and Columbia University employed me for teaching and research. Without these experiences in the US, I couldn't have become a professor and president of Seoul National University, nor Prime Minister of Korea, not to mention Commissioner of KBO. Actually, I watched more than 100 baseball games when I was a graduate student in the United States. That's why it took not 4 years, but 5 years for me to complete the doctoral dissertation at Princeton. Anyway, I learned a lot about baseball at that time. And in my book on baseball, on Ode to Baseball, I mentioned that baseball is a microcosm of our lives, Underperforming teams come back to win the championship in baseball. Whether you win or lose, the season continues and baseball resembles life the most in this regard. Baseball has been my friend since I was little. Baseball connected me with friends growing up and became a refuge for my life. I'm very proud to have thrown the first pitches on 2 occasions, one in June 2012 at the Red Sox versus Blue Jays game,
Wow.
and the other in July 2018 at the Mets versus Yankees game.
Wow.
And I was a ardent fan of both the Mets and the Yankees. The Mets when I was a graduate student, and the Yankees when I was assistant professor at Columbia. As to the U.S. ROK baseball exchanges, Mrs. Chano Park, Hyunjin Ryu, and Shin-Soo Choi, who played in the U.S., and many good players from the U.S. Korea contributed to a lot to betterment in mutual understanding between Korea and the U.S. And one of the former ambassadors, Mr. Mark Lippert, is a very famous Tusan Bears fan. He frequently visits Korea to see one of the games between the Tusan Bears and other teams.
Yeah, I much appreciate the fact that under this rubric of shared growth, we have been able to talk about so many subjects, and I am very grateful to you, Prime Minister, for spending such time and talking with us in such a thoughtful way across such a range of issues. I mean, you bring so much experience, so much expertise, so much insight to this, so much wisdom. And most of all, I really appreciate the fact we've learned a little bit more, and I know about your ties with the United States and your vision for what the relationship should look like. So I've really enjoyed our conversation. I want to thank you very much, and really hope that we can continue to share ideas about shared growth and about much else.
네, 다시 한번 초대해 주셔서 고맙습니다. 그러나 좀 더 자연스럽게 얘기했으면 좋았을 텐데, 제가 스피킹도 라이팅도 다 좋진 않지만 그래도 라이팅이 스피킹보다 나아서 라이트하는 것을 그냥 읽어서 부자연스럽게 됐다면 미안하게 생각합니다.
잘 들었습니다. 아주 좋은 말씀을 많이 들었습니다. 많이 배웠어요.
감사합니다.
다음에 직접 만나서 만나서 자유롭게 얘기만
한번 다시 만나 뵙고 싶습니다.
그렇게 그때까지 기대합니다. 네, 감사합니다.
네, 고맙습니다.